Not used to such a gracious introduction there. Chairman Neal, members of the committee, today I bring to you House Bill 863. It's the Small Business Assistance Act of 2012. This bill addresses three things. The bill increases the no-bid limit for spending by state agencies through the Department of Administrative Services from $5,000 to $25,000. The Department of Administrative Services will still have in place mandatory contracts on certain bid items such as vehicles, computers, and other things. The second thing the bill does is it defines small business when the Department of Administrative Services decides to use the definition of a Georgia small business as a preference in bidding. What this bill says that is a Georgia small business, it's basically says that the business must physically be doing business in the state of Georgia for at least a year, and if it's a new business, it's domiciled in Georgia and regularly maintains a place of business in the state of Georgia, and it cannot be conducting business from a P.O. box, a site trailer, or a temporary structure. The other part of that also is that the small business, the amount of revenue that business can receive in a year, we're raising that limit from $1 million to $50 million, and we're raising the number of employees from 100 to less than 500. The third part this bill does is a technical change in the Purchasing Advisory Council. It lists the members, and one of the members is the commissioner. It says in the bill is the commissioner of technical and adult education, and that's changed since this bill was revised, and it's now the commissioner of the technical college system of Georgia. In summary, the bill will allow small business some small businesses that are probably not bidding on items now in the state of Georgia for different agencies. It's going to allow them and give them the opportunity to bid on items that they may not have bid on them before because of the cumbersome bid process. The Department of Administrative Services in fiscal year 11 documented that between the $5,000 and $25,000 level, there were $250+ million spent in those thresholds, and that's going to be $250 million worth of business that some small businesses that may not have been bidding on this in the past are possibly going to be doing. It's going to allow for agencies to take advantage of pricing more quickly than they have in the past. We all know and see discounts on items that people you may need, and because of the bid process now, you may not be able to take advantage of those because it takes a while for the bid to go through, and this is going to allow agencies to act on those discounts. There's still going to be oversight by the Department of Administrative Services like they do, and it's going to the excess personnel that they may have because of these changes is going to allow for better oversight and making sure that our agencies are spending wisely and making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. I truly believe this is going to be a bill that's going to add to our small businesses and the purchases and the business that they can receive every year or from now on. It's going to allow these small businesses to grow, to hire more people, and improve our economy. Thank you, and I'll attempt to answer any questions that I may have, and I do have several individuals here from the Department of Administrative Services, and they're here to help me if I can't answer the questions.
Are they here to testify or to answer questions?
They're here to back me up.
Oh, okay. They got your back. All right. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see Mr. Kim out there. Welcome. My question is for Jill, though. Jill, if you could, on legal counsel on Terry, I'm sorry. I was wondering why she was looking at me funny. I'm sorry.
That's not the reason.
I was in the wrong committee there. Sorry. I've got 6 committees, everyone, so I apologize. Terry, on line 47, dealing with for the purpose of this part, my concern with redefining small business and Georgia resident on line 55 through 57, that we're not going to have any tax implications, or we're not going to get into any kind of situations with the tax code and Department of Revenue or anything like that. This is simply and only, and it's limited to the definition under this code section, correct? What does that mean? And I guess that was my question.
Well, the code section is broken down into various sections that have various terms that describe them. The part is probably about as small as you'll see, other than a code section. You have chapters, articles, parts, and then the sections generally. Part is relatively small. Now, I did not draft this bill, so I cannot tell you what's in this part. I'll be glad to.
But part is,
clarify that.
being part, it's small. It's not a large term, and that's why I was asking.
Over to Title 48, which is your tax provisions, which is going to involve most of your tax issues.
All right, thank you. And to the author, defining small business as 500 employees or $50 million or less.
Yes.
Is that a standard term across the board for everyone as a definition of small business?
I'm not going to say it's a standard across the term for everyone. Other states, is that what you're asking, sort of?
Yeah.
Or there are several other states that do that. There's 5. I'm trying to remember exactly which states they are. Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Kentucky are actually a little bit lower than that. Where those numbers came from is the U.S. Small Business Administration, the North American Industry Classification System codes. It's a 40-page document that breaks all of the different industries down by category. And looking at that, this is by far will capture most all of those all of those businesses in there. It is an increase, yes, from where we were, but it's going to also open it up to more small businesses to qualify for this, in this category.
Sounds pretty official to me. Thank you.
Well, we have managed to light up the board like a Christmas tree.
All right.
So here we go. Representative Chokas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, I went ahead and read that update you had on the small business definition and increase in value that you gave me the other day.
Yes.
I've got a couple of questions, and you may or may not be able to answer them. We went from a maximum of $5,000 to $25,000 per transaction as the threshold. My question is, was that an arbitrary number? How did y'all come to the $25,000? And then I've got a follow-up.
Okay. Joe, would you like to? Mr. Kim, I'm sorry.
Good afternoon, Representative Chokas. We came to that dollar threshold by looking at the various competitive bidding thresholds of neighboring states, and the $25,000 brings us in line with what neighboring states are doing. Also, just anecdotally, based on kind of the walking around, our own experience. This definition has not been updated in over 10 years, and just some of the things that I've bought, I know that the prices have tripled. My cost of motor oil has tripled, so that's kind of where it came from.
Gotcha. All right, Mr. Chairman, may I have one more? Thank you. The other question that I had was DOAS. They felt that because of the budgetary restraints or constraints that we have right now, that this increase in threshold would not be abused. And what I wanted to find out is what type of accounting practices, or what do you want to? What are y'all going to employ to ensure the scrutiny of these transactions and make sure that that will not be abused?
We have an electronic commerce system called Team Georgia Marketplace that allows us to track the spend of those agencies that are on Team Georgia Marketplace. Not all of the agencies are on it. Most of the big agencies are. I think our last remaining implementation is to bring the Technical College System of Georgia onto the system, but that will allow us to capture the spend data. The other thing I would point out is in the Trading with the State Act, which is it's not being changed by this bill. That prohibits state employees and state officials from doing business with family members or businesses in which their family members have a, quote, substantial interest. There's an exception. They're allowed to do business with businesses that they're related to only if it's pursuant to a competitive bid. So you cannot buy using the small value threshold from your family. Otherwise, you're going to run afoul of the Trading with the State Act.
Well, my concern, and this is something that came out of Chairman Davis's committee last year and had been a problem several years ago, was with the P cards and the abuse of the P cards.
Right.
And I personally think this is good. I think it falls within normal business practices. I just want to make sure that the state dollars are accounted for and that we have in place the accounting tools to prevent abuse.
We believe that we do, and going back to the P cards, I would say the P cards was actually a human failure. It wasn't really a P card failure. Nobody was minding the train, paying attention to how the P cards were being used. If anything, P cards made it very easy to spot the abuse once somebody started looking at it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Bowden.
My question is about
Do you have your phone?
the size of small business. I heard what you said about how you came up with 500 employees. But I'm still interested in knowing, are we trying to make it where we can do business with small businesses? I mean, is that the intent?
Yes.
With having the 500 employees, that's a rather large small business.
It is a relatively large business, small business.
I'm thinking that number is so large that if you've got someone that is smaller, it will be hard for them. If you've got someone with 10, 15, 25 employees, it may be hard for them to compete with a 500 employee company. So I was trying to figure out if the intent is to do the business with small businesses, do we have that number too high?
Well, I think it's, if you look at this classification system, it is middle of the road. It's where.
For small business?
Yes.
Because I was just at a chamber meeting and they were talking about their small businesses that were 250 and below, and that's why that number jumped out at me.
Okay.
I was just curious. Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Jurgensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Apologize for my tardiness this afternoon. To my good friend, this is a friendly set of questions. You and I have had this conversation a couple times already, and I'll be following up on Representative's line of questioning. I personally believe that 500 employees is not a small business. Representative Green struggles to have 500 people in his district sometimes, but in all seriousness, you and I have discussed this.
Right.
Representative Hamilton, Chairman Hamilton, has a similar proposal in which he is using the indexing formula.
Right.
And my question directly to that is, would you be amenable to amend this bill to use the language from Chairman Hamilton's bill to use that indexing for small businesses so that each industry is treated differently within the confines of what is the recognized number for employees of a small business?
The system that Chairman Hamilton has introduced on his bill is where we got the 500 number. There, if you look through this, there are numbers from 500 to 750 to 1,000 and even higher, and it's an either or number of employees or amount of gross sales. one particular section in that Chairman Hamilton's the code uses that I personally have some difficulty with is in the agricultural world. It sets the revenue a lot lower than I think it needs to be for many of your different farmers, and their limit is 100 employees. And I do know that there are a lot of farmers that hire quite a few more people than 100. So in that realm, I do have issues with using that. So it's kind of a happy medium between the two is where we got the number, and it's simple. I mean, it's used 50 million, less than 50 million in gross sales, or less than 500 employees, and you don't necessarily have to have access to this to come up to know where you stand.
But isn't it true that there are a lot of individual industries within that same set of parameters that are much lower than 500 employees? It cuts both ways.
Well, yeah, it's all lower than which they're 500's in there a lot. So, but yes, there are businesses that are less than 500.
Would you be amenable to looking at a smaller number than 500? The businesses that I know in my community and a lot of areas around the state have much lower number of employees to be considered a small business than 500. If we're going to call this the Small Business Assistance Act of 2012, I have grave reservations about setting that bar so high if the intent is to enable to have the state look at situations with small businesses and we know that over 80% of the employees that are employed in the state of Georgia are by small businesses.
Right.
And if that's the intent of the bill, I think it would behoove us to look at that in a very serious light.
Well, I will say that we have looked at it in a serious light, and this is for purposes of of being able to bid as a small business and Department of Administrative Services. It's we're not saying on a whole, I guess, it's statewide level that you are a small business. If you're over these parameters, you could still not be considered a small business. What is that definition? That's what you're talking about. So, would we be amenable? I'll have to check.
I understand. Thank you.
I'm going to go out of order just a moment, if you two will allow me, Representative Hill and Representative Kidd, because Representative Chokas has just shared something with me I'd like for him to share with the committee on a follow-up to Representative Jurgensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some information and some knowledge of this because the SBDC, Small Business Development Centers, which is funded by the state to help small business, and the federal Small Business Administration, they define small business as 500 employees or less. So to answer your question, that's the definition that we as the state of Georgia and the federal government uses to define small business. Now that does not prevent anyone with smaller numbers from participating in the program, but that's pretty much the accepted number and size of small business, not only nationally but also at the state level.
Representative Hill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And mine's question's really to kind of follow up on Chairman Davis. And I guess my question, sir, is on line 49 through 54, where we're defining a Georgia resident business. What is the purpose behind this definition? What are we trying to accomplish by this definition?
This does go back to the original question that Chairman Davis had raised about what's the impact of the definition of a small business. And this Small Business Assistance Act, it was originally part of the Small Business Assistance Act of 1975. It has not been updated since then. And there's another code section that's not included in here because the policy statement is still the same, and that is to make sure that small businesses have a fair opportunity to get state contracts and state subcontracts. The reason we wanted to add the Georgia resident requirement into the definition of a small business is to the extent that we have there's also a small business advisory council that will give policy level direction to the agency in terms of how to promote small business opportunities. But to the extent that the Georgia residency definition is missing, which it currently is, and just I think everybody has forgotten about that or just overlooked it, a small business from Ohio, or nothing against Ohio or Michigan, but an out-of-state small business would then be the beneficiary of any kind of a special program. And I think what we're trying to do here is to help, through the Georgia's procurement system, in a targeted and controlled fashion, promote more small business opportunities for a lot of local bidders, and that's part of the rationale for the for raising the small value no bid threshold from 5,000 to 25,000, so that when it's more economical for folks, for agencies and colleges and universities to buy from local merchants, they can do that rather than having to go through the state contracting process.
Okay, so as I understand that, this definition here might be utilized in other places as we go on.
Just for purposes of state procurement.
Right. Within that, and I guess that kind of leads up to my question, I'm concerned that we might be missing a couple things, and I know a definition is always hard to make and it's flexible, but there are companies out there that actually advertise office spaces that will make you look like you're a big company and aren't, and they do nothing more than actually provide sometimes a desk, sometimes a receptionist, a telephone number like that, so it looks like they're a resident. And here, while we're not including post office boxes or site trailers or temporary structures, we're missing this whole other category of these from post office boxes, etc., through these other more sophisticated companies that just provide a leased office. And additionally, there's no requirement to have any sort of Georgia business licensure. And so I'm wondering if this is the definition we're really looking at, or perhaps we might want to look at expanding that definition to really capture it for the purposes you stated.
If you think that there's a hole in the definition, we're certainly open to discussing that. I mean, I think the intent there is so that we don't have a kind of a fake or a paper company claiming.
Mm-hmm.
It does say that they're physically conducting business in Georgia, so that would, I guess, that kind of covers a little bit of that. But I hear what you're saying about the mailboxes, et cetera, and stuff like that too.
I just don't want us to leave a hole if you have an intent to go one direction. I just feel a little like we're missing something.
Representative Kidd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Leader, I support very much so the concept of what you're doing. A question kind of off this a little bit. I believe the existing law of the state required, or states, I don't think very many people go by it, but the law says that every office of state government, governor's office, legislator's office, city, county government, schools, etc., by law are required to first look at the products and so forth made by the Department of Corrections before they buy outside of that. Now, I don't think anybody does that, but that's what the law says. Not in the statute you've got right here, but the law does say that. And so if we're going to change this, I think we ought to look at that aspect and change it at the same time. Otherwise, everybody's going to be obviously breaking one law to abide by another law. I don't think anybody pays attention to the first law anyway, but that's what it says.
Mr. Kim informed me that correctional.
I'm just pointing that out. There's being conflict with another law that's sitting out there, and I know whatever passes last carries precedent. But I'm in support of what you're trying to do.
Thank you.
Representative Jurgensen.
One more question. Following up on Chairman Hill's question on line 51 where it says, or a new business that is domiciled in Georgia. If I could ask our legislative counsel, what is the actual legal term there for domiciled? What does that give indication to? Is it corporate headquarters in Georgia, or an LLC, or just doing business in Georgia?
I'm really can't
No.
answer that.
Okay.
Generally, you do have a residency requirement when you're giving some sort of preference for Georgia businesses that they employ residents within the state, for example, and those types of requirements that seem to be absent from that definition. But
Okay.
it's my understanding that they're registered with the Secretary of State, but I hesitate to, it's a corporation, where you usually see it, that word domicile with corporation, not so much small business.
Right.
Small business usually is a business license.
Okay.
Hesitate on looking at,
That might be one area that we look at
To
of
elaborate there.
elaborate instead of domicile, some other wording that would ensure that these are actually businesses
corporations.
owned and operated in Georgia.
Members of the committee, any further questions or comments?
Obviously,
Representative.
excuse me, thank you. Obviously, many people, not many, but some people have some verbiage changes, and I don't want the, bill to be slowed down too much because obviously it'll get caught up pretty soon. What's the posture for getting something back to the committee and back out reasonably quickly, or do we trust the chairman to, trust the author of the bill that if we moved it on, that he make corrections in the process?
I want to make sure that if we pass it out of this committee, it's perfected when it leaves the committee.
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine with me, but we want to perfect it today, or can we get it back out quickly?
Let's do this. Representative Jurgensen and Representative Davis and Representative Chokas and Representative Hill and Representative Hatchett, Leader Hatchett, if y'all get together and let's see if we can have substitute language that we can bring back at our next meeting. And we typically meet on Tuesdays, and we won't be in session next Tuesday. We'll be off for Valentine's Day next Tuesday. So we will either meet next Wednesday. That's probably what we'll do. If y'all can get something together this evening or tomorrow, we may try to squeeze a meeting in on Thursday.
Okay.
But if y'all get together and work on some language, y'all get together and work on some language. Let's try. Let's see if we can get this ready to run out a meeting on Thursday, maybe even tomorrow. Representative Davis, the keeper of knowledge here, the Chairman Davis, thinks we can have it ready tomorrow. But if y'all just get together and work on that language for us, I'd appreciate that very much.
Thank you, Chairman Neal.
I think everybody has a
agree.
feel for where the committee wants to go with this. So
Thank you.
thank you. Appreciate you. Representative Benfield here. We had a conversation earlier on the floor today. She's in another meeting as well, and okay. Let's get Representative Flood. Representative Flood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I bring to you House Bill 816. I've heard a lot of robust discussion recently over what constitutes a small business and the importance of small businesses to the state. I'd like to shift the attention not to small businesses but to American-made companies. I kind of believe that fundamentally the development of good jobs and strong family incomes in Georgia is a fundamental obligation of the state. To that point, there was a commission that was in place during the 9/11 commemoration. And they decided they wanted to commemorate the loss of lives by buying bracelets. They bought 70,000 bracelets to commemorate 9/11. All the bracelets were made in China. In the last year, $84 billion in U.S. contracts were awarded to foreign-made goods and services. In the past 5 years, the federal government has awarded contracts worth more than $500 billion, with a B, in foreign goods and services. Every manufacturing job in this country has a multiplier effect that creates more good jobs. That's why it's important to spend American tax dollars to buy American-made products. My legislation would provide an incentive for state purchasing agencies to seek out and buy goods that were manufactured, grown, mined, produced, created within the United States. We need manufacturing jobs right here in America, right here in Georgia. Putting state dollars to work right here at home supports job creation right here rather than abroad. Our taxpayer dollars should be used to buy the best made American products, rewarding companies and workers who play by our rules and our values, not subsidizing foreign manufacturers who disregard environmental standards, ignore workplace safety, and take advantage of workers. By the way, preference for American-made products has been in place for over 80 years. In 1982, Ronald Reagan signed an expansion of Buy American laws for highway and transit projects in the middle of a recession. The polling on this is kind of interesting. 91% of Americans believe that Buy American is a good concept. 94% of Democrats believe this. 90% of Republicans believe this. 89% of Tea Party enthusiasts, and 88% of independent voters. According to the Alliance of American Manufacturers, manufacturing employment increases by about a third when these provisions are put in place. House Bill 816 creates jobs, rewards American companies, promotes American companies, and helps get Georgia back to work. Take you through the bill. It's a fairly simple, straightforward process. Section 2 is really where the definitions are. Made in America will mean that the components of any product would be 51% manufactured, grown, created, mined, or otherwise produced within the boundaries of the United States. A preference of up to 15% would be made for products that are made in the United States. And in the event that there is a procurement of a product that is not yet readily available in the United States, then the state agencies will be asked to post that product for a 30-day comment period to allow any potential American manufacturer to be aware that there may be an opportunity for them to create a product that would have a procurement opportunity with the state of Georgia. There would be a penalty for someone who would violate the law. Essentially, they would be barred from state contracts for 5 years. The contract that they entered into may be void, and that the purchasing agency or the state agency would be able to recover civil damages up to 3 times the 15% or up to 15% preference that was allowed. That's essentially what the bill does. Mr. Chairman, I am welcome to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Chairman Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Flood, first of all, shockingly, you and I might actually agree on a policy. I absolutely agree with the concept for which you're bringing forward. Okay,
thank you.
And I think that we do have a large problem in the United States with our industrial base and our manufacturing base being shipped overseas. I support your concept. I do have some detailed questions, on the actual number at 15%. I think we have a Georgia preference in it. Is it? Do we not have a Georgia preference, or we've talked about a Georgia preference at 5%? Anyone? No. So I wanted to kind of know how you came up with the 15%, and then I also wanted to talk about the feasibility of the 30-day comment period,
Okay.
or the notices by the departments in that. But again, these are friendly questions,
Sure,
basically on
sure.
the details, but I support the concept.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the questions. The 15% is somewhat of an arbitrary number. The Alliance of American Manufacturers, who has essentially been promoting these Buy American concepts, have recommended 25%. I thought that was a bit too high, and so 15% is somewhat of a flexible number, but it's relatively arbitrary.
Right. And are we getting into any kind of Federal Trade Act issues with this legislation? Are we going to have any backlash from the feds or anything like that?
Again, another great question. And if you look in lines 38 through 44, basically said that nothing in this bill would violate any current federal statutes. Furthermore, these bills have been vetted, and they withstand scrutiny through the World Trade Organization and other international trade agreements.
So you're saying I'm going to be agreeing with the World Trade Organization as well?
I'm saying that you would be in compliance with the law. That's all I'm saying.
Ooh. Someone's turning. So, all right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. And, thank you very much for bringing this bill again, Representative Flood. I also have questions in the details, and it sounds rather simple to beginning with, but the definition of the United States. For example, would that include Puerto Rico? Puerto Rico is most definitely part of the United States, may in fact someday become a state, just as Alaska and Hawaii went through that process a few years ago. So what would the definition of the United States be in this instance? Would that include, for example, Puerto Rico, which even has somebody sitting in the Congress, even though they don't vote, they do have a representative, sitting on the floor of our Congress.
That's a question that I frankly wrestled with in drafting the bill, as to do we define the United States in the bill, which is, to your point. I opted not to, but I believe that the traditional definition of what is defined as the United States are all the 50 states plus any U.S. territories and possessions, which would include Puerto Rico.
Okay, including all its territories and possessions.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you very much. If we were to go any further, I think I would. I'd like to see that somewhere, that definition within here, just to clarify things for people that aren't in this room today listening to this conversation.
That's a great question, and
type of thing I'd like to see.
I would yield to your insight on that, and would be receptive to a clearer definition of the United States.
Thank you so much, sir.
Representative Horn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the bill, for Representative Flood. But I do have also some detailed questions, if you don't mind. 51% of the components of a product, manufactured, created, or whatever. How are we going to know that, and who's going to police that?
Again, in it's Section 2 of the bill, the manufacturers would essentially have to self-report that the products were made in the United States, and if they're found in violation, then there would be penalties, including the voiding of the contract and subject to civil penalties.
So the manufacturers are going to self-certify.
Correct.
Okay. Procured products, the definition there, that's everything, basically. Is there a list of items that the state buys? I bet that list is pretty extensive.
I would imagine it is pretty extensive.
Okay. 15% of all of these things that are on this list have to be made inside of the United States? Is that 15% in a dollar value or a pure quantity or what? Because, you know, we probably buy a lot of concrete and we buy a lot of asphalt, all of which is probably made in Georgia, actually. So is that
Representative Horn, the 15% doesn't refer to the quantity of products purchased. The 15% refers to the dollar amount.
Dollar amount, okay.
Correct. So there would be a 15% preference. So in other words, if there were two bids and one was at $100 and the products were 40% made in the United States, 60% made in Mexico, Brazil, China, Taiwan, Canada, as compared to a $115 product that was 60% made in the United States, the state agency would give preference to the product that was made in the United States.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I wonder if there's anyone here from the state who might be able to tell us whether or not this would tie their hands or not.
Well, it's, there are other questions, and I think the Department of Administrative Services is prepared to speak. But let's continue with the questions that we have, and then we'll turn to him if that'd be okay. Representative Jurgens.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. I do support the concept of the bill. We were just sitting here discussing, and with my knowledge of the construction industry, I could possibly see some real issues. For example, concrete. Not to my knowledge is cement manufactured in the United States. The great majority of it is actually made in Mexico and shipped in. Cement, not concrete, but cement. It's then put together here with aggregate, sand, and water.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we classify the 51% situation in that scenario? Because obviously the gravel's mined here, the sand's dredged here, and it goes to the issue with, is it by weight, is it by volume? We're building a new set of sloppy Floyd buildings, for example, a tremendous amount of concrete in that building.
Well, excellent point, Representative Jurgens said. This does not require the state to buy products that are not made in the United States. So if concrete is not made in the United States, then there would be no opportunity for them to purchase concrete in the United States. So the traditional procurement process would still be in place, and they would procure concrete from the places that they already procure concrete.
But it would give a preference to the contract if 51% of the material were made in the United States, right?
That's correct.
That contractor would have a 15% preference. So, and I just use that as an example because I know that cement is not manufactured here. So, I mean, have we thought through that process of things that are maybe put together in Georgia but not manufactured in the United States, and asphalt, for example, some is manufactured here, some's not, and how we all go through that I think it's more going to be problematic in the construction arena than it would be the actual, buying paper or buying office supplies or whatever it might be. That's pretty easy to determine. So I just wondered if you've given thought to that concept.
Well, yes, I have. In fact, I had a conversation earlier with Mr. Kim about this, and I know he's got some comments. But interestingly enough, I did some research and found that there was, in the construction arena, there was a company that found that in the construction of a company called Lewandowski Construction in Montana, they converted to a Buy American concept only. So all the components of their construction was Buy American, and it increased the price only by 1%. And I do have, I've had a conversation with Mr. Kim about how we classify by weight, by volume, by price, and I'm open to tightening the language so that it is much clearer. I appreciate your questions, and I think those are very valid questions that we need to address. But I agree that it seems to me that this concept is one that is really born out of the idea of creating more American jobs and helping American-made products be more available to state agencies that are using our taxpayer dollars to fund those companies.
Okay. Thank you.
Members, any more questions for Representative Flood? Okay, Representative Wagner.
I know we're talking about made in America, but do you know of any examples of like Georgia companies that have, you know, been hurt by not having some kind of Buy Georgia or Buy American policy?
Yeah, anecdotally, this is not a Buy Georgia specifically, but I understand that there's a process by which we buy buses now, and the buses are all made in North Carolina, although we have a Georgia-based company, Bluebird, that manufactures buses right here in Georgia. But we've changed some policies, and our procurement policies now have us buying products made in North Carolina when we've got a comparable and competitive product that's made right here in Georgia. So this bill is Buy American, and it certainly there might be some potential to help Georgia companies. That's the intent of the law. Thank you.
Okay. Any other representatives? Thank you, Representative Flood.
Thank you.
If you'll step aside, we'll get Mr. Kim in, and we may call you back up if we need to in just a few moments. But Mr. Kim, if you would. As Chairman Davis said, this is your day today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Davis. We commend Representative Flood for introducing this bill. I think he's on the same page as we are in terms of the importance of job creation. We do have some concerns with the details of the bill, implementing the bill. I think it's been borne out by some of the questions from some of the committee members. For example, the requirement that something that be made in the United States is at least 51% of the components are manufactured, created, grown, mined, or otherwise produced within the boundaries of the United States. How are we going to police the composition of those products? If you've got a bidder, if the state solicits bid, the low bid is $1 million. The second low bid is $1.1 million. There's an extra $100,000. The second bidder comes in and says, mine is made in the USA, I've certified it, he hasn't, the low bid hasn't, you need to pay the extra $100,000. And then you're going to get a protest, and then the bidders are going to be arguing over, is it 45%, is it 49%, is it 50%, is it 52%? And from a procurement point of view, the state agencies are going to, I don't know how the state agencies are going to resolve that. First of all, it's going to be very time-consuming. Is it based on dollars? Is it based on weight? How do you factor in labor? How does labor? Let's say all of the materials come from out of the United States, but all of the labor is in the United States. How do you weight that? I don't know, and so I think that's just trying to figure out what constitutes 51%. That's a major administrative concern that we have. I think the other concern that we've got is if something is, if let's say the $1 million bid is 45% made in the United States, let's say there's no dispute as to the composition. If the $1 million bid is 45% made in the United States and the $1.1 million bid is 55% made in the United States, they're kind of comparable. Is it worth spending the extra $100,000 in a world of limited budgets? The agencies don't want to have to spend that money unless they absolutely have to. And so, and then, for example, in a contract, let's say we advertise a supply contract with thousands of supplies. Some of those supplies are made in the United States, some of those are not. How do we then weight that? And so we just think that there's the administrative specifics of how to implement this bill is going to be very cumbersome. And we would certainly have no objection to using made in the USA as some kind of a tiebreaker. We use, I think Chairman Davis had asked the question about Georgia preferences, and we use Georgia preference right now as one of our tiebreakers. There's nothing wrong with we would not object to using Made in the USA as a tiebreaker, but 15% is a pretty big preference. It can add up to a lot of money. The state, I think right now we've got about $1.8 billion in spend times 15%. That's how much extra we could potentially be paying. Those are our concerns, and I guess the other thing is it doesn't really, it's a Georgia. We can actually see a Georgia-based company potentially being hurt by this bill. Say you're a Georgia-based seller or distributor of some product that's partially made in the United States but doesn't meet that 51% threshold, and you've got an Ohio or Michigan-based company that sells products that are 55-60% made in the United States. That Ohio-based seller is going to get the advantage over the Georgia-based seller. That's one of the unintended consequences that we're looking, and we just think there's going to be a lot of other unintended consequences that we haven't really had a chance to flesh out. And so those are the types of concerns that we've got. Certainly welcome any questions from the committee members.
Thank you. Chairman Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You turned me off so fast, I was like, man. Yeah, definitely not through. This is one of the greatest committees that we have in the General Assembly. Everyone out here, there's 100-some people in here getting to see a committee really vet a bill here. I think the definition in section subparagraph 1, lines 15 through 17 is it's written intentionally vague to give you some flexibility to make some decision making as per what the 51% is. I noticed on line 16 that the word or was used instead of and. In our business up here, ands and ors are very important. So I think there's enough flexibility there. You can use some common sense, or the department can self-regulate itself to make a determination to whether or not the product was manufactured, created, grown, mined, or otherwise. I mean, that's pretty vague and gives you a lot of flexibility to make a decision. So I don't share some of the concerns that some of my colleagues here on the panel have about whether or not what you can determine what 51% is or not. I think it's vague enough to where you can make that decision and you won't be violating the law to do it. I do agree with you, Mr. Kim, on the 15%. I think that number's a little high with the volume and the dollar figures that we're dealing with. If we're making a multi-million-dollar decision, 15% can be a lot of money. Representative Flood, I mean, it's your bill and it's presented. I think that there's still some more questions. I still support it as it's written, with maybe a reduction in the percentage to maybe a 5% preference. But some of the questions on determining whether or not it's 51%, I think it's vague enough so you can determine that yourself through the department, in my opinion.
Thank you for allowing me to ask a question. We've agreed that we all like this, it seems like, but the devil's in the details. So have you given thought other than what would you do to fix the bill so we can pass it, so we can buy American? That's what I really want to know.
That I don't know yet. I had my first conversation with Representative Flood this afternoon. I was actually planning on being here for the other bill, and then I just happened to see this. But at this point, I'm not sure. I think there needs. I wish I could give you a better answer, but I think I still need to kind of vet it with staff and internally to try and figure out what we would like to see from this bill. I think that I do still have a concern regarding the arbitrariness of the 51% threshold and the unintended consequences to local sellers of products, depending on whether something's 45% or 55%. I'm just not sure.
Are you familiar with the Made in Georgia products? How are they policed to be certified that they're made in Georgia or produced in Georgia, like the farm products?
I don't know about the farm products. I know that for our state preference,
Not for what you're buying, but the Made in Georgia emblem that gets to be put on the
I'm not
product,
familiar
how
with
you
that.
do that.
I'm not familiar with that.
It would seem that whatever standard is used for that ought to be applicable to this.
Representative Jurgensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In lieu of all the questions, I'm going to move that the committee table this bill and ask that Representative Flood and Mr. Kim get together and maybe polish this off and see if there's some common ground with some definitions and terms and bring it back before the committee. I think there's a lot of support for the bill and the concept, and we need to try to do that and move this forward.
We have a motion to table. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, aye? Oh, pardon? Okay, well, let's discuss. We have a motion to table, so let's discuss the motion. Anybody have any? Representative Buckner says, "Why can't we put a committee together?" Anybody else have any comments on our motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll amend my motion to table the bill until the next meeting, and in the interim, request that you appoint some members from this committee to help with the process.
Does that satisfy Representative Buckner? Okay. All in favor, aye? Opposed, no? Okay, Representative Flood, we'll get together and I'll let me think about who I want to do that. I won't appoint those just yet. We'll talk tomorrow. If we don't get together after this meeting today, we'll talk tomorrow and get 2 or 3 folks hooked up with you and Mr. Kim. We'll see if we can refine this. Thank you. Appreciate it. Are you through to where you're going to be able to be with us for a little bit? Okay. All right, we're going to do something real quick because I think we can take care of this one really quickly. Representative Chokas, if you could, House Resolution 1325, I believe, if you could very quickly address us with House Resolution 1325.
Can we do it from here, sir?
That would be perfect.
Perfect. Do I need to? I'm on. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I bring before you House Resolution 1325. At a meeting of this committee at Jackson State Prison, we were shocked to discover that they've got a tremendous problem with illegal cell phones being smuggled into the prisons. For a 12-month period, 8,500 cell phones were brought into the prisons illegally. 300 visitors were arrested and 60 staff employees were arrested for bringing these contraband into the prisons. The problem with the cell phone usage in the prisons is it's leading to the use of the inmates of organized crime occurring or being conducted in the prisons by leaders of gangs and having these activities done outside the prisons, as well as disruption in the prison systems and protest within the prison, being coordinated from one prison to another prison, so we're having multiple prisons and even across state lines throughout the United States. And this resolution is an urging resolution urging Congress to act on allowing cell phone jammers in the prisons so that we can prevent this from occurring. Apparently there is an outdated FCC rule that prevents the use of cell phone jammers in the United States, and we want this corrected. We have taken the liberty to talk with Senator Johnny Isakson and his people, and also with Congressman Gingrey, and they are aware of the problem through recent publications. And what we're trying to do is build a groundswell of support. This resolution, if we get it successful and passed, we're going to send it to all the Department of Corrections in the United States so that they can contact their representatives in Congress and really get something done and something changed at the federal level. And with that, I ask for your favorable consideration and answer any questions.
Chairman Davis.
At the proper time, I'd like to be recognized for a motion.
I don't see any questions. I think this is one the committee is very familiar with, especially after hearing from the Department of Corrections, and apparently we're ready for that motion.
Do pass, Mr. Chairman.
We have a second. All in favor, aye. Aye. Opposed, no. It is passed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Representative Benfield.
Maybe Mr. Chokas could present my bill since he seems to be on a roll. Thank you so much, and I apologize I wasn't here when you first called the bill. I've been dealing with a redistricting issue for DeKalb County, which is always lots of fun. I am here before you today on House Bill 653. It's very straightforward. It simply states that incarcerated females in Georgia shall not be restrained, and that includes handcuffs, during delivery, labor, or post-delivery, unless there is a reasonable basis to believe that the restraint is necessary to prevent the female inmate from injuring herself or others. So the language is very straightforward. I do have one proposed amendment that I would ask the committee to consider, and that's on line 16. After the word recovery, insert the following: for such time as prescribed by her treating physician. So it would say after recovery, comma, for such time as prescribed by her treating physician. And that will just narrow the time frame, because otherwise it could be subjective as to how long the recovery period would last. I do have a coalition of partners who have been working on this issue. They have a red folder that y'all have received. The group is called Dignity and Wellness for Georgia Families. With the chair's permission, how I'd like to proceed is have Bianca Campbell with the group sort of moderate and call several witnesses, and then each of them are only going to present for a few minutes. I think we've got four witnesses, and then I'm happy to return and answer questions at that point. Is that okay, Mr. Chairman?
How many witnesses did you say you have?
4? So 4, just a few minutes each.
Okay. All right, that'll be fine.
And I would like to say publicly that I am very grateful to the Sheriff's Association. I know Oliver Hunter is here, and we've also been meeting with Terry Norris. They have been extremely gracious in meeting with us and discussing this issue, and also the Department of Corrections. We've been talking with Joan Heath as well, and I appreciate their cooperation and help on this.
Thank you. If you could give us your full name and who you're with.
Yes, hi, and hello everyone. My name is Bianca Campbell. I'm with the coalition, which is called the Dignity and Wellness for Georgia Families Coalition. So we're here today to have a conversation that needs to be amplified with action. We're having one that is of a growing necessity across the nation. The female incarcerated population has risen exponentially across the United States, and Georgia has seen some of the biggest increases in recent years. Within 1977 to 2004, Georgia's female imprisonment rate grew over close to 600%, and that's an increase of about 7.9% each year. And this increase is predominantly due to arrests for nonviolent crime. With this in mind, the average percentage of women in various states of pregnancy is about 7%. And we're more likely to encounter women who are not only incarcerated but pregnant as the increase continues to rise. So with the idea in mind that we haven't necessarily had to talk about the treatment of women just because they haven't been a huge population is probably why this bill is coming in now in 2012 as opposed to earlier years. So this is a conversation that is not only necessary because the population is here and it's growing, but it's one that can be dealt with action today, and that's through the passage of HB 653. Restrained childbirth does happen here in Georgia, and members of the Coalition for Dignity and Wellness for Georgia Families conducted a study in time for last year's legislative session. We opened and filed a request for open request records in 159 counties in Georgia, hearing back from 143. Only 12 had any policy on how they treat women during actual childbirth. Of them, only 3 explicitly state that they do not use restraint during labor. We also have the Department of Corrections who has updated their policy, and for the last 3 years they have not used restraints on women during actual childbirth. And we think that these are exemplary state policies that need to happen statewide, because it shouldn't matter where a woman is serving her time. Mental health, maternal health, paternal health is a statewide issue no matter where you are serving your time. I have witnesses here today who speak from this impact in Metro Atlanta primarily, and support the passage of HB 653 to address their concerns. Today we have Dr. Michael Lindsay, who is an OBGYN at Grady. We have Ashley McCrae, who has experienced restrained childbirth, and we have the written testimony of several nurses. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Lindsay.
Good afternoon. I want first off to thank the committee for allowing me the opportunity to share these brief comments with you. And this is from the perspective of a high-risk obstetrician. I'm currently the chief of the OBGYN service at Grady Memorial Hospital and the director of the Division of Maternal Fetal Medicine. And I've been in that, an employee of Emory University for 26 years. And so I'm speaking from the perspective of a clinician who's managed patients, pregnant women who've been in restraints. And over the course of my 26-year stay at Grady, there have been hundreds and hundreds of women that I have cared for. And what I wanted to share with the committee is just from the perspective of a physician, some of the potential ways that restraints can compromise our ability to provide the patient optimum care. And I just kind of want to highlight some really common clinical situations. Early in pregnancy, mothers typically experience nausea and vomiting, and it's very difficult to provide optimum care with someone who has restraints on, who's experiencing a lot of nausea and vomiting, and you could appreciate that. One of the biggest things, however, and this relates specifically when mothers come into labor, if they're restrained, it limits your ability to do a complete examination. And you can just imagine if someone has a restraint on their arms or on their legs, then your ability to fully examine them and to have them participate in the exam may be compromised. And then finally, once the mother has delivered, from a bonding standpoint, you can imagine it would be very difficult to hold a baby if you had your arms in restraints or if you had your legs in restraints. So I make the appeal from a medical standpoint that it would improve our ability to provide patients optimum care if they're not in restraints when they are presenting to labor. And I'm fully supportive of this bill. In addition, the professional organization, which I'm a member of, the American Congress of Obstetrics and Gynecology, which represents 40,000 obstetricians in the U.S., is also supportive of the concept of not having mothers in labor have restraints. So again, thank you for the opportunity to share the perspective of a physician, and I'm very supportive of this bill, and I think if we had this bill in Georgia, it would be a very important step forward. Thank you.
Doctor, I'd like for you to give an opportunity if any members of the committee have a question for the doctor. Any members have a question? Representative Reese.
I just wondered, I didn't understand how often you encounter this problem to what degree the shackles are still being used during labor and childbirth?
In terms of on our particular service,
Right.
it's not something that happens that frequently. I can comment on it in terms of providing prenatal care in the prenatal clinics, because that's where I'm at usually 4 days a week. I mean, it's a very, very common occurrence in the prenatal clinic, although I realize that this bill addresses specifically the labor and delivery process.
Mm-hmm.
It happens more in our institution, not necessarily in labor, but in the post-delivery period after the mother has delivered. So it does happen in our institution, but not typically in labor. So I can only speak to what happens in our particular hospital.
Thank you.
Representative Chokas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to follow up with Ms. Barbara's question. Have you witnessed that? Is this a recurring problem during labor that mothers are in restraint? And I mean, how many times have you seen it in your practice, sir?
As I mentioned, in terms of the policy that we have at our hospital, may be different from what's happening statewide, but in our hospital, the policy is for patients who come for the prenatal clinic, they are in restraints. So we have numerous patients who come for a prenatal clinic who are in restraints. When they come up in labor and delivery, our policy usually is to ask the officers to take them out of restraints. And usually most of the officers, at least on our service, have been agreeable, but occasionally, you know, they will keep the patients in restraints. So I have seen it. In terms of quantifying it, it's not something that happens very frequently on our service, and that's what I would say.
So it's not something that happens frequently.
But remember now, I'm speaking from the perspective of one obstetrician in one hospital, so I'm talking about what happens at Grady Memorial Hospital. So that's my perspective from Grady. So I'm not speaking about what happens statewide, because I'm not in a position to do that.
Doctor, have you personally delivered with the mother in restraints?
Yes, I have. What kind of restraints?
Chairman Davis.
The mother had handcuffs on, and she had a restraint that she was attached to the bed by the handcuffs, and she had leg restraints, so she was attached to her bed. And you can imagine that kind of limits the things that you can do. And you may not be familiar with obstetrics, but sometimes things happen very, very rapidly, and you're in an emergency, and you have to go very quickly, and have to go and get a guard to, you know, take a restraint off. You know, that minute may be very valuable in terms of your birth outcome. So it's something that you really would want to avoid.
Any other questions from the members? You want to come back to the witness?
Well, I just wanted to comment that in the packet there is a survey of.
We're live right now. We need you to go to the witness stand if you.
Sorry, am I on camera now? I just wanted to comment that in the packet there is a two-pager on the survey that was done throughout the state, and it does detail some of the counties where this practice is occurring, and that might be somewhat responsive to the issues raised by Representative Chokas. So I would direct you to review that as well.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Buckner.
Thank you for being here. In the labor and delivery rooms, those are generally rooms where a patient would have a difficult time escaping from at that time. Is that not correct?
Well, in the setup at Grady Hospital, it would be difficult to escape. I mean, you're in a room and there's one door, but I mean, the reality is if someone's in active labor, and I'm sure you've seen someone in labor, escape is
I've done that before.
Right. It's the last thing. It's probably the last thing on their mind. So I don't think they'll escape during the labor process.
And generally, those rooms wouldn't have like a window where they would want to try to jump out or to be of any danger to themselves. I'm thinking that the shackles are or the restraints are to keep them from either hurting someone or running away. And to get at the point of the bill, that if there's no danger of them escaping or no danger of them jumping out a window or hurting themselves, then if the officer were outside the door where they could come in, that might be enough security, is where I'm going with my questions.
Well, at least from my experience, that's what we do at grading. It's worked. I mean, in the 26 years, I'm not aware of any pregnant patient in labor who's escaped from the facility. But
thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
And with me now, I have Ashley McCrae, who has experienced this firsthand. And I also wanted to briefly mention a few 2 points. Most times, women who are incarcerated have high-risk pregnancies due to the lifestyle that they may have lived beforehand that got them into the situation that they are incarcerated. And these high-risk pregnancies typically result in cesarean sections. And so the situation of having to remove the restraints to preserve the life of both the mother and baby is actually very common, just because high-risk pregnancies are very common. So the need to remove restraints isn't just a one-time fluke. It is actually very common. And additionally, because they're having a C-section, they often try to get the woman to give birth vaginally first, and they are given an epidural, so they are numb from the waist down. So to increase the likelihood of them escaping is not very high. They're paralyzed from the waist down, and then they are most oftentimes surgically cut across the stomach for the C-section. So just to emphasize the likelihood of escape and emphasizing the safety factor there. And now I have Miss Ashley McCrae. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ashley McCrae, and I was an inmate in 2008 in Cobb County for theft by taking. I made a mistake and took money from my job in hopes of taking care of my children, and not knowing that there was another way. So that was my first time ever being in trouble. I graduated high school with a 3.8. I came from Hurricane Katrina. I never thought that I would be in that much trouble for that. I didn't think I would go to prison for it, but I did. They asked me to serve 6 months. I did 2 months in county and 4 months in prison. And while I was in county, I was denied, of course, a lot of, we forget about the things that needs to happen before you give birth. Far as prenatal vitamins, I didn't have. When I was taken out to see the OBGYN, which was after 2 months of being there, I had restraints around my belly. I had restraints on my wrist, and I was 8 months 8 months pregnant at the time. It was too tight. You barely can sit down. They wouldn't loosen them. When you get to the doctor's office, they ask them to remove it. They don't. They do remove the ankles, but they just don't remove the ones around your belly and your wrist. And when I entered Atlanta Medical to give birth, I was forced to have a C-section. I was told I didn't have any rights. I had never had a C-section before. They told me I had to be out within a certain time. They tried to force my delivery by giving me Pitocin, which helps make the baby come quicker. He wasn't coming quick enough, so I had my right hand handcuffed to the bed, and during the pain and everything, you really can't move, and it's a hard thing to be strapped to a bed giving birth. I was told that if I didn't have him, or had he not dilated anymore by 8 o'clock that morning, that they was going to give me a C-section. I told the guy I had never had a C-section. I had 2 sons prior. He told me, when you're in jail, you don't have any rights. They took me in to give the C-section. Still, one handcuff was to the bed. Once I gave birth to the baby, I came out. The captain immediately told the guard that she needed to put the handcuffs on my ankles, because I was no different than no one else, and they didn't want to take the chance of me going nowhere. And I had just had a C-section. The doctor told her, I'm pretty sure she's in a lot of pain. She said, that's not my concern. I have to do my job, which states she needs to have restraints around her wrist. At that point, she did remove the ones on my arm, but I still had to be there for the 2 days I did have with my son. I still had to be there with restraints on my ankles. So.
Any questions from committee members? Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks.
Thank Thank you, guys. And in addition to Ashley's story, I do want to point out one very important thing. She was also on an epidural, which is why I found out deeply information about what an epidural does. And not only that, but when you are trying to puncture the water bag, that, you know, her problem with the doctor is that her water hadn't broken, and so the baby wasn't coming out. And so they wanted to puncture the water bag so that they can have the delivery. And what happens, typically you're supposed to be you're supposed to be bowed down and face forward so that the insertion can kind of gently go up into the vaginal canal. But when you're chained, you're actually on your back, and so you're not in the actual position. And there's testimony that you guys have towards the back that says, from a nurse's perspective, that that is actually a more painful process when you don't do it in the proper position, and that was directly because of the restraints that she had, where she had to be on her back as opposed to on her knees. So. With that, I would like to provide the legal perspective. We have Kathleen Birch, who is going to talk to the legal analysis of it, and she is a current professor at John Marshall School of Law. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee, members of the public, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today regarding HB 653. I'm Kathleen Birch, a tenured member on the faculty of Atlanta's John Marshall Law School, where I teach constitutional law. My testimony is going to focus on the constitutional standards. The restraint of a female inmate while she is in labor or during delivery or post-delivery violates the Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which is applicable to the state of Georgia and its political subdivisions through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, which includes the necessary and wanton infliction of pain. In Estelle versus Gamble, the United States Supreme Court held that a state can violate the Eighth Amendment when it provides inadequate medical treatment to inmates. The standard for determining whether medical treatment is adequate is whether there has been a deliberate indifference to serious medical needs of the prisoner. Deliberate indifference includes intentionally denying or delaying access to medical care or intentionally interfering with medical treatment once it is prescribed by medical personnel. To establish an Eighth Amendment violation, two elements must be met. First, the inmate must have a serious medical condition. Second, the prison authorities must have been deliberately indifferent to the medical needs of the inmate. In Hellig versus McKinney, the U.S. Supreme Court defined a serious medical condition as one that is sure or very likely to cause serious illness and needless suffering, or a condition that is so obvious that even a lay person would easily recognize the necessity for a doctor's attention. Actual injury due to indifference is not required. Unnecessary suffering and mental anguish from delay in care is sufficient for the Eighth Amendment purposes, as is conduct that causes severe emotional distress. Thus, we don't need an actual physical injury to the mother or the child in order for there to be an Eighth Amendment violation. Conscious indifference to the inmate's condition by the prison authorities is not required. Mere knowledge of the inmate's serious medical needs or circumstances clearly indicating the existence of such needs will establish deliberate indifference. Through this two-pronged legal test, a court is attempting to assess whether society considers the risk that the inmate complains of to be so grave that it violates contemporary standards of decency to expose anyone unwilling to such a risk. So let's apply this legal standard to the restraint of a female inmate while in labor or delivery. Labor and delivery is so obvious that even a lay person would easily recognize the necessity for a doctor's attention. Moreover, it would be obvious to prison authorities that a female inmate is in labor, delivery, or has just delivered a child. The question then is whether the restraint of a female inmate during labor and delivery is deliberately indifferent such that it violates contemporary standards of decency. Contemporary standards of decency can be found in the policy directives of the American Medical Association, the American Correctional Association, and the Federal Bureaus of Prisons. The American Medical Association supports language adopted by the New Mexico legislature, which provides, and now I'm quoting the New Mexico language, an adult or juvenile correctional facility, detention center, or local jail shall use the least restrictive restraints necessary when the facility has actual or constructive knowledge that an inmate is in the second or third trimester of pregnancy. No restraints of any kind shall be used on an inmate who is in labor, delivering her baby, or recuperating from delivery unless there are compelling grounds to believe that the inmate presents 1. An immediate and serious threat of harm to herself, staff, or others, or 2. A substantial flight risk and cannot be reasonably contained by other means. If an inmate who is in labor or who is delivering her baby is restrained, only the least restrictive restraints necessary to ensure safety and security shall be used. The American Correctional Association Policy number 4-4354-1 provides that all penal institutions should have a written policy, procedure, and practice in general prohibiting the use of restraints on female offenders during active labor and the delivery of a child. Any deviation from the prohibition requires approval by and guidance on methodology from the medical authority, basically the doctor, and is based on documented serious security risks. The Federal Bureau of Prisons policy provides that an inmate who is in labor, delivering her baby, or is in post-delivery recuperation, or who is being transported or housed in an outside medical facility for the purpose of treating labor symptoms, delivering her baby, or post-delivery recuperation should not be placed in restraints unless there are reasonable grounds to believe the inmate presents an immediate, serious threat of hurting herself, staff, or others, or there are reasonable grounds to believe the inmate presents an immediate and credible risk of escape that cannot be reasonably contained through other methods. As early as 1994, federal courts have held that while a woman is in labor, restraining is inhumane and violates her constitutional rights. In Nelson versus Correctional Medical Services, the 8th Circuit of Appeals found that a correctional officer violated a pregnant inmate's clearly established 8th Amendment rights by restraining her during labor. More recently, the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington and the United States District Court for the Middle District of Tennessee held that restraining pregnant inmates during labor and delivery violated the 8th Amendment. Moreover, the United Nations Convention Against Torture prohibits the use of restraints on female inmates during labor and delivery. It is actually defined as a method of torture. Because it is well settled that restraining pregnant inmates is a violation of the 8th Amendment, the state of Georgia is at risk. Currently, correctional officers have substantial discretion as to when to restrain pregnant inmates. By enacting HB 653, the state will be providing a statewide policy which will limit Georgia's exposure to liability from the actions of individual correctional officers. Those cases which have actually gone to trial, the awards given have ranged from the low 6 figures to almost $1 million in damages that have been awarded to women and children when the mother has been restrained during delivery. I'll take any questions and thank you for your time.
Chairman Davis.
This is clearly a sensitive issue, and while I don't have some of the experiences that Representative Buckner might have had, I am a parent, and I was there when my children were born, and I can understand that it's not an ideal situation, but you'll agree that sometimes there's a necessity. We're not talking about a general hospital here. We're talking about prison inmates. There's circumstances where these inmates spit, they throw blood, they're rough people sometimes, not all, but sometimes. And there could be dangers if you have someone that might be HIV pregnant. The concern I have is the bill says that they shall be prohibited. And to me, that takes all discretionary to the current situation that a a guard or a doctor or a nurse in the room might or might not have. You could have an HIV positive inmate that pulls an IV out and pokes a nurse. I mean, there's all kinds of circumstances. And what we're doing is we're taking that discretion out the window by prohibiting it across the board.
With due respect, I don't believe so, because immediately after prohibited comes the unless language.
You specifically said there was a clear indifference and there had to be documented circumstances of the reasoning behind is what you said. You said clear documentation.
The court says, in the cases in which the federal courts have looked at this issue, they are saying that there has to be specific findings, whether it's the doctor who says there's a danger here or the officer who says this individual is acting out and is a danger to the medical staff or to themselves. And those are specific exceptions, even under the policy. Sorry, let me.
The doctor might not know the circumstances for which the person is incarcerated. I'm playing the devil's advocate here, and that's what I'm trying to tell you is that when we pass law that puts restrictions on people without documented, clear, convincing evidence, if a guard feels like there might be a circumstance, maybe they had an argument about the handcuff before they walked into the room with the doctor, and there's so many on-the-ground issues that we went to Jackson State Prison earlier this year. Now there's no females there, but I mean it's a scary place, and there's scary people there, and I would never wish in a million years for my wife to ever be strapped to a bed and have a child. Okay, but this is a prison, and these are inmates that have they might be, some of them might be petty theft like the young lady but we also have murderers, we have all kinds of circumstances that these people are violent offenders. They're not all just petty theft. These are violent inmates on both male and females. So to me, I am concerned that we heard Ms. Campbell speak. I think it's Ms. Campbell. Ms. Campbell speak that hasn't been done in 3 years. So I think the policy is that we don't do it. But there's always a circumstance that might arise at that instance. And to me, I'm a supporter of our public safety officials, and I'm worried about handcuffing them and putting them in dangerous situations to where they can be infected with lifelong diseases and all different kinds of things that they could have syphilis or gonorrhea or HIV or to me we're looking at a specific law here.
Two things, if I could. First is it's my understanding that the Sheriff's and Department of Corrections have reviewed this language.
Well, the Sheriff's Association has reviewed the reasonable basis to believe the use of restraints is necessary language. And I don't want to speak for them. Mr. Hunter's here, so I invite you to review that with him. Also, the 3 years is the Department of Corrections has been working on revising their internal policies. But part of the problem here is that there are 159 counties, each with their own sheriff's department, and there's no uniform way, short of putting it in the statute and codifying it, of putting some consistency in the policies for the 159 sheriff's departments. So that's one of the compelling reasons for codifying it, and certainly if it's in the code, it has the strength of law. But I hear what you're saying, but I think this language is sufficient. Reasonable basis to believe the use of restraints is necessary to prevent such inmate injury.
I guess my point is if we pass this law, okay, and I understand what the intent is, okay, and trust me, I understand what the intent is and support the sensitive nature of what we're talking about. But what we're doing though is take the health risk out of it. We're putting in danger if an officer decides that he wants that he's fear that something's going to happen, and this officer does or doesn't do something, okay, then they're going to be at risk from lawsuits or firing of their job if they used precaution in handling a situation. Then they could lose their job. There could be all kinds of things. They didn't have the proper documentation as presented. There's.
Are you done?
I am. I don't know exactly how I want to word it, but you get where I'm going.
Because this is giving them a If we don't have a law on this issue, then it invites lawsuits. This gives them a codified reason where they can use restraints where necessary.
And that goes to the crux of what I was just talking about. She was saying that the reasonable basis is a documented.
She's referring to one case, a federal case where, in that particular case, that's what the federal courts require. But if we put in the Georgia Code reasonable basis, that creates that's what is expected of law enforcement. They have a reasonable basis. There's no documentation requirement here in the Georgia Code.
Coming into this meeting, I actually had really no big concerns about this bill, but the more she read, the more I got concerned about the officers in this situation and their rights. Okay, because they're not the inmates; they're the ones there trying to do their job and protect the public and everything else. And now they're going to. To me, it's the opposite of what you're saying. It's going to put them at risk of losing their job.
No, I think what the court is saying in these cases is that there has to be a factual basis that's specific to the particular inmate. So in your question when you said, what if this is unlike a petty or nonviolent individual, but someone who has murdered or has had a violent crime, that to begin with would place that inmate, pregnant or otherwise, in a separate category. And then whatever that behavior is going into it would be things that would be. So in other words, when it's the policies, it's not the court that's saying you have to document this, is what you take a look at. What I was reading was the policies of the American Medical Association, the Bureau of Prisons. What they want is the guard to document either in the medical file or in their report what it is that was going on at the moment in time that gave them the reasonable belief to fear harm to the patient, or the patient was going to harm themselves or others, or were a flight risk. And the reason to do that, in all honesty, is what you're asking the officer to do at that time is to write down the evidence that's going to be needed by the Attorney General or whoever the attorney is in court, making the argument that they had a factual basis to do what they did. So
and that's a better argument. From that's not what I heard the first time you were speaking. And that's why I was.
Because there were two places, and I have the testimony written with the references in them and the court cases, and I will leave them. I have copies for everyone on the committee. But what's happening is the courts are saying this is an Eighth Amendment violation unless there is a reasonable basis to believe, based on this particular inmate, that they are harm to themselves or others or a flight risk. So in other words, what the court is saying is don't leave it to the discretion of an individual officer to decide on a particular day they want to restrain one inmate but not another that's in labor. Give us a reason why it was reasonable for the officer to act a particular way. That inmate was had acted out in prison, was a murderer, was acting out there at the hospital, was grabbing medical equipment, was doing whatever it was that would tell a judge or a jury this person should have been restrained. Any reasonable person would have said this individual was going to hurt themselves or others. So what you're looking for the guard to do is to actually document on paper, and that's the policy where we're talking about the written statements. Have the guard tell us at the time, when they're making their reports or in the medical record, what it is that was happening as to why the patient was restrained. The inmate was restrained. We're not talking that you have to have it before you put on the restraints. Those are split-second decisions. You're going to make that report afterwards.
And that's
just
exactly what I meant.
Right. What we're trying to do here is balance between the split-second decision the doctor needs to make for the health of the mother and the child, and the split-second decision that the officers have had to make. In the best world, the doctor would be documenting the medical chart as to what was going on, and we'd have the guard making whatever report the guard needs to make. But the language here that there's a reasonable basis, that's what we're looking for. And that's what the courts have looked for and said, in the cases where the states have lost, is because the guards couldn't come out and say why they had actually restrained the woman. It's been much like the testimony we heard today is, I was told by my superiors that I had to restrain this person. I wasn't given any discretion. Everyone outside of the prison that's being transported for medical treatment has to be restrained. So,
if I could have y'all move over here. There are a lot of people that came today, and I'm sure that they're trying to look around you to see a little bit. That's.
And Mr. Chairman, can I follow up with 1 second before you go to their testimony as well?
Yes.
When you get done speaking. I thought you were done.
No, go right ahead, Mr. Chairman.
I just want to clarify that you know, the devil's always in the details, and you've heard from all the different bills that have been up here. You know, there's consequences to our actions here, and all I'm saying is, have we looked at all of them? And that you know, I'm not out for, you know, disrespecting or anyone, including yourself, ma'am.
Oh no, that's fine. I just want to say, standing here listening, I want to make it clear from what I experienced. We take numerous amount of tests when you first enter. So going into that medical, when I got there, a whole lot of paperwork was given to that doctor on who I was and what did I have syphilis, did I have gonorrhea, did I have any of these diseases. So going in, he knew exactly what I was. And then another thing I want to state is that there's an indecisiveness because the bill is not here. So when I left the prison that day, not knowing I was even going to give birth, but I heard the captain say to them, you don't need to restrain her. You know, I feel like she's not even supposed to be here. She has never given us any problems. You know, her ankles are swollen. They're hurting. She's not going to do anything. Don't put no restraints on her. And then when I pull up to the actual hospital, the captain there says, she's no special. She's no different than anybody else. You need to put restraints on her. So when my ankle's swollen, and so I think it's just a level of indecisiveness because the bill is not here. So there's a captain here, but then there's a captain over here who don't really care what the captain over here said, because as of this moment she's with me and I'm saying this is what you need to do. So I think if the bill was in place, not to take away from hurting anyone, because I feel like there is a consequence to everything that we do in life. So, but what I am saying is that there are inmates like me, and I'm just hoping maybe to help the other inmate, or praying that they never get there. But if you are there and if you're in this situation, to me it's just straight torture and abuse of what you go through with those restraints on your ankle, or being cuffed to the bed, or looking at your son hoping, I hope he don't remember that mommy got restraints on her ankles while I'm holding him. So I definitely understand what you're saying, but as of me experiencing it, there are many tests that's taken before you enter. There are many, they know who you are, sometimes better than you do. And when you walk into that medical place, they definitely know this is the inmate that I'm dealing with. These are some of the things that they're dealing with. We need to make sure we need to caution ourselves. Or like some doctors say, can you please remove the restraints? I don't think she's a harm. And then them saying no because this is not in place.
Yeah. Representative Horn, I think you may have had a question for Ms. Birch.
Well, I actually, at first glance, I thought this was a rather reasonable and humane bill, but the more I read it, the more I wonder now. The way we do things today, are you telling me that a lawsuit is imminent? Is that what you just said? You just said we are in violation of the 8th Amendment. That's what you said.
I am saying that if Miss Ashley...
And which court, again,
it would
can
be
you tell us?
So if I were the attorney, hypothetically here, for Miss for our witness, and their statute of limitations had not run, it would be a Section 1983 claim in federal court, and I would, on behalf of the female inmate, be making a claim under the 8th Amendment that this was a cruel and unusual treatment of her while she was incarcerated. And the question here becomes then is we're past, I guess I should say, is because there are several federal courts, not just trial courts, but federal courts across the country, including courts of appeal, what's going to happen at this point is it should no longer be a question as to whether or not it's well-settled law that restraining a pregnant inmate during labor, okay, with the caveat if they are a danger to themselves, others, or a flight risk, right? If they're that, then you don't have an 8th Amendment problem. But if they're not, okay, if they're a nonviolent offender, they're not acting out in the hospital, there's no reason to expect them to run. There's no reason to expect them to hurt themselves. There's no reason to expect them to hurt the medical staff, okay? Then it's well-settled law, federal law, that restraining that individual during labor and recovery up until the doctor says they're fine medically, it would be a violation of the 8th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which is applicable to the state of Georgia through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So what the question then becomes is, yes, if this was a law school exam, the answer should be The state of Georgia will lose on the liability question. All that is left for a jury is to decide how much money to give the mother and child. And you do not have to have a physical injury to the mother or child in order for there to be recovery. There must just be mental anguish. When you take a look at the Eighth Amendment jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, they say humiliation is sufficient for an Eighth Amendment violation. And that's where you're getting these very large awards in other states when people have brought. Just recently, the state of Washington got hit with $900 and something thousand for an inmate who gave birth while in jail. So the smallest award I've seen of what's been published is something like $109,000. So we're not talking just minor amounts that the juries are awarding these women. We're talking fairly large sums, and the liability seems to be a settled question.
But I think it's important to stress how passing this bill might help protect Georgia against these lawsuits.
Well, I'm getting to that. I'm
yeah.
getting to that because on 16 and 17, I'm sitting here asking, what is the definition of reasonable?
It's a reasonable person, and that's why you want enough.
Well, here's what I'm getting at. Here's what I'm getting at. I'm assuming that corrections or the sheriff's deputy will make the call.
Yeah,
as to whether
it would
or not
be
to restrain.
right.
Hold on.
I'm sorry.
I'm assuming that the sheriff's deputy will make the call, or the corrections officer will make the call as to whether or not to restrain a lady who is in labor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they do that. Well, let's say something bad happens. All right, baby dies, woman dies, both of them die, whatever. Okay, so then what happens? There is liability. Who's liable? How much are they liable for? So what is exactly does reasonable mean? So it sounds to me like if we don't do this, you're telling me that based on your opinion of the reading of these court opinions that we're liable under an Eighth Amendment violation. But if we do this, well, we're liable because nobody really knows. I mean, reasonable is a subjective thing. Mm-hmm. So. What I'm hearing is that maybe we shouldn't restrain anybody. I don't know.
No, reasonable is an accepted legal standard. I mean, it is replete throughout the Georgia Code and replete throughout common law. I mean, it is an accepted standard. It's like
but reasonable can be argued in court, correct?
Those are well understood and accepted.
I understand, but reasonable can be argued in court, correct? I mean, if a situation like what I just described happens. I mean, can that not be argued in court?
But it's an accepted standard. I mean, we've got to put a standard in the law, so let's put the standard in that is accepted and easily understood. I mean, the reasonable man standard.
Okay, I'm all right.
Thank you. To respond to or to add to what Representative Benfield said is, by having by adopting this bill and making it the law in Georgia, what you are now doing is putting a unifying standard across the state. It is very clearly the policy of the state that this doesn't happen except in those situations where the mother is a danger to herself or others or is a flight risk. And then when your question becomes what is reasonable is a factual question. We can't prevent people from suing, but is it more likely than not that the state will then win, and will they win early on in the litigation? More likely than not. No guarantees here, but more likely than not. And if you have the proper training of your officers as what is reasonable, if you look for these things, and please document it in the medical record or on whatever form the correctional staff use for their reports at the end of their shift, then you have the facts that your attorney needs in order to prove that the officer's actions at that point in time were reasonable.
I'm Representative Horn.
Yeah, just this. I don't really have a question. I just would be interested to know if somebody from corrections might be able to, or somebody can.
And Oliver Hunter is here with the sheriff's
department. We're running way over, so if you all could.
I think the doctor wants to say something.
A real brief comment, and it's
let me ask you a question before you make a comment. When is the last time you delivered mother in restraints?
Me personally, probably about 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay. Now, what was your comment that you?
No, I wanted to make a comment. I didn't want people to walk away with the impression that there's a risk of law enforcement or even healthcare providers getting infections from pregnant women. I mean, that's very, very uncommon. And there was a comment made about risk of HIV, gonorrhea, syphilis. For a healthcare provider, even to get those infections, I mean, that's unheard of. And what we do when we deliver patients, we have on gowns, we have on gloves, and all of these diseases are called sexually transmitted diseases. And so the way you get the infection is by having sex with the person. But for the person who's doing the delivery, there is really minimum or no risk for them of getting those infections. So I just wanted to make sure that that information was.
Thank you. If you all can step aside, and Oliver, if you'd come, I think we have somebody that has a question for you. We have went far beyond the time that I envisioned this meeting to go. Representative Buckner.
During such time that she is within a healthcare facility experiencing labor and during delivery, that they will have the option of removing the restraints and standing outside the door because there's no window to jump out of and there's no way for them to escape unless they might be armed with each other.
Well, perhaps. I know when this bill was first presented to us, I went to one of our largest providers for medical care for jails throughout the state and asked them what they thought of it. And they actually have deliveries when in some place in the actual institution they're set up to do that. And the doctor explained to me that as a general rule they don't have any restraints applied during active delivery. And so this bill posed no difficulties at all for them because they currently don't do it anyway. And I checked around and talked around with sheriffs for the most part around the state. Most felt like this was not a situation that posed a real issue for them in terms of safety. There was some concern, obviously, from the committee about dangers or being the health issues or safety issues. I think basically there's some familiarity with the patient generally, and they are aware of the difficulties the inmate may or may not pose, and they will use frankly the common sense judgment about what inmate can or can't be trusted to act appropriately. I think the standard would be essentially, would there be an articulable reason to put a restraint upon an inmate / patient, and if you can articulate a valid reason, it doesn't be a perfect reason or you need to say the best reason, but if you can articulate a reason why you feel justified in doing so, the sheriffs felt comfortable they could do that. If they were deputies make a call, this inmate should be restrained, that they could justify, and they based on the history, the crime, the incidents, the pattern of behavior while incarcerated, a number of reasons, things they could look to make a determination that this person should or shouldn't be restrained. Getting back, I think I perhaps didn't answer your initial question about adding the language.
You did clarify that
it occurs.
Feel like they can handle when the restraints.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. They yeah. We would.
They don't have a problem with the bill as it is.
Well, our only concern with Representative Benfield is very gracious to work with us as well, and we frankly enjoyed and appreciated having her come to us before things got too far along, was that our concern was how long would the recovery be. We didn't want a subjective standard. We wanted a trained professional. We felt comfortable having a trained professional, the doctor, determine how long recovery was, as opposed to it being all across the board. You know, at least it may have some standard. We trust the physician to make the determination when the recovery is ended and the strength could be properly replaced back on. And so there was some discomfort initially, but the sheriffs are quite comfortable with this. And I checked around with Correctel, I believe it is. They have about 100 jails in the state, and they do the health care within the jails. And their medical staff informed me that they had no difficulties with this language at all, because they presently don't restrain them anyway. And they were actually in the institution for the most part for the delivery. So we had planned to take really no position on it. I mean, we don't have a position on it, but we are very comfortable with our personnel making decisions about the appropriateness of restraints being placed on a female patient. We don't think, for the most part, they're in active labor, that they pose a tremendous risk. Is there no questions?
Any other questions? Chairman Davis.
I didn't have a question. Wait, is he done?
Yes, I'm done.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Chairman.
All right, thank you. First to the doctor. I'm a real estate broker. I'm not in the medical field, so I just threw out the first three that came to my mind. Okay, okay. So there was no factual medical data behind those comments, other than those were the first three things that came to my mind. I would like to, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if this bill is in the proper venue. I actually think this could go before the judiciary. There's some legal ramifications within it, and some terminology that maybe the lawyers down there could look at. But there's a lot of questions in here because of the details dealing with, when does labor start, when does the restraint start or end, how long the recovery is, what is reasonable, what the documentation that's going to be required. To me, if you'll recognize me, I'll make a motion, Mr. Chairman.
Turn you back off, Chairman Davis.
Did I get my allotment for the day?
Yeah, your microphone has no more power in it. I hear from the committee some concerns about some of the language. I hear that the sheriffs are not very concerned about whether this passes or not, because it will have no impact really on what they're doing. I hear the Department of Corrections already has policy in place as well. And we're here to 5 o'clock or after, and we weren't supposed to do that. I want to give a little bit more. I want to work with this a little bit more to see if we can determine, first of all, if it's passing legislation that is unnecessary because it's been dealt with on the county levels and the correction levels over the last couple of years. I want to hear from some of the committee members if we can make some of those adjustments in language that would make you comfortable. So I'm not through with this bill. I'm not ready to move it yet, but I'm not through with it, and I don't think any of us want to stay any longer. It's already after 5 o'clock. We've been here over 2 hours already. Here's what I want to do. I'm going to put together a group of us, and I'll I'll think about who I want to put on that group. I know a couple of you already are saying, please not me. But we're gonna meet separately in a small group to see if we can do a little bit with this language. Representative Benfield, thank you. Thank you all for coming. A full house that stayed for a long time, and thank you for that. Members, do y'all have anything else before we? Looks like you're ready to go. Meeting adjourned.